Okay, our first writer is Ray Ziemer. He's a lifelong writer of prose and poetry, currently finishing a young adult novel, The Ghost of Jamie McVeigh. He teaches writing part-time at College of DuPage and is a member of the Batavia Writers Group. His piece, I Heard They Were Closing St. Casimir's, won a first prize in Poets and Patrons Chicagoland Poetry Contest, and Writing with Gary was published in the most recent Prairie Light Review. He's born and bred on Chicago's South Side, and that comes through in his writing. He's made his home of 30 years on the West Branch of the DuPage River with his wife and extended family, which includes a 91-year-old father-in-law, several dogs and cats, and grown sons who also contribute to the family construction business. Ray, please come on up.
Thanks, Kevin. Ann, thank you. They're talking about climate crisis. I think we here in the urban areas might not be as aware as others of how what's happening right now. I think maybe in the agricultural areas they're dealing with it right now, and especially out west where they're suffering from ongoing drought, and the Rocky Mountains where whole forests are being decimated by pine beetles and things related to climate change. So I guess that's why I set my story in Professor Valley, Utah. Professor Valley is a sort of Garden of Eden in the high desert of southeastern Utah. It's below the LaSalle Mountains and the high mesas. Sweet cold water gushes from an ancient spring, and generations of cowboys and Indians and hippies and utopians and survivalists have been dreaming of life in that oasis where people might weather storms of social and climate change. And I ask, how will we, in the succeeding generation, choose to conduct ourselves when tempests tear at the framework of society? And how will we maintain our values through the coming struggles? In the story, Jefferson Tanner is the leader of a diverse community that's banded together in Professor Valley. They're threatened on one side by Ross White, a militaristic rancher from Polar Mesa, while all along the riverbanks have sprung shanty towns and camps of squatters and refugees, many of them displaced from drowned coastal lands or fleeing the collapse of urban society. Jefferson and his people wonder if there's anything they can do to avert violence. Is there anything they can offer that can't just be taken by force? Greeley, Jefferson's right-hand man, has returned from a trip downriver with more of the usual dire news. The forests are dying, drying up, and burning around them. Plagues of invasive species decimate the meager crops that have survived the 40-year drought. Terrorism is commonplace. Industrial destruction of the environment continues. Governments bankrupt and infrastructure crumbling. Greeley's barely avoided being hijacked at gunpoint, but has convinced the couple, a pair of desperate former school teachers, to join the group instead. Meanwhile, one of Ross White's steers grazing in Professor Valley pasture has been stolen by the squatters. Jefferson fears the men from Polar Mesa will be provoked to violence. They heard the rumble of the trucks long before the dust clouds billowed above the Polar Mesa road. The morning sky was shading to deep blue overhead, though the sun wouldn't beam into Professor Valley for another hour yet. "Jeff," Greeley called through the screen door, "the Whites are on the move." Jefferson came out buckling his holster and following through the orchard, stopping at the gate where several other men waited. Rodriguez hefted his Winchester. "Lonnie," Jefferson said, "you and Zach quick load up a couple shotguns and bring them out here. Manny," he called, "take a dirt bike out through the culvert and bust tail down river to warn Big Ben. Get them to leave the camp, and don't let Ross's men see you." "Okay," the young man dashed off. A minute later, they heard the motorcycles whine before it dropped down into the wash. A truck came into view on the cliffside above. Eventually, the full convoy emerged from the narrow gap in the red rock, grinding down the steep incline in low range. Ross's Suburban, 3 pickups, and the stake truck all bristled with long guns. They clattered up to the cattle guard in front of the ranch gate, the men shouting and brandishing their weapons. Lonnie took up position under a cottonwood while Zach sauntered with his gun muzzle down to stand at the gate opposite Greeley. Jefferson ambled over to the dust-caked vehicle. "Billy," he said flatly with a nod to the driver. Leaning into the passenger side window, he tried to keep his voice normal. "Morning, Ross," he said. "Where are you heading?" The big man touched the brim of his Stetson. "Good morning to you too, Jefferson," he grumbled. The white eyebrows and mustache looked like a comical disguise on the man's tanned leather face. "I understand you lost track of one of my animals." Jefferson sighed. "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that. Come on up to the house for some coffee." "Maybe later," Ross said, nodding down the road. "My boys, they got some cowboying to do at Big Bend." "Gotta teach 'em a lesson, by God," Billy brayed and thumped the hood of the car. "Those folks down there are just hungry, Ross. We ought to think about how we can help." Ross snorted. "We take care of our own around here." Turning, he muttered, "Let's roll, son." Around the time the first shafts of sunlight fanned off the mesa, they heard the chatter of gunfire echoing from downriver. It didn't last long. The field workers drifted together and gazed toward the plume of black smoke rising up from the canyon. Just before noon, the white convoy rattled once more to the Professor Valley gate. Greeley walked out to meet them, leaning in at the Suburban's window. "Got your steer for you," Ross growled. They rolled the hacked-up carcass off the back of the stake truck and into the powdery red dirt. The bloody mess was badly butchered, buzzing with flies. "Anybody hurt?" Greeley asked. "Not much resistance," Ross stated. The place was pretty much cleared out, almost as if they knew we was coming. "How about that?" Ross gave him a hard look. "Let the professor know we'll be back down tomorrow. Time to bring our herd back home." Next morning, they heard horses' hooves thunking down the Rocky Canyon Road. Manny, Rodriguez, and the boys met Billy and two other White Ranch cowboys at the gate, paced them down to the lower pasture. It wasn't much of a roundup, collecting steers from the flat fenced field. Still, the Herefords had grown comfortable down there amid last year's hay and tried every stubborn cow trick to stay put. Ross White arrived in his Jeep, sent his dogs out to work, and sat along the fence watching. Greeley walked over and invited him up to the house. Ross looked askance at the tall bookshelves as he walked through the library and out through the French doors. Jefferson handed over a steaming mug, and Ross took a careful sip. My, he murmured, smacking his lips. "Is this the real thing?" "Almost," Jefferson chuckled. "There's a few beans in there amongst the carrot chips and sticks. Lord, I do sure miss my coffee in the mornings." They sat quietly for a while in the big wooden chairs, watching the horses and cattle kick up clouds of dust. Ross tapped his fingers and stood up with a grunt and wandered back into the library. "That sure is a nice eagle kachina," he said, eyeing the tall carving with its still bright colors. "Always admired it, the older style with the eagle feathers." "Yeah, Dad bought it down on the Hopi res." "And this old black and white bowl, something you dug up in the hills?" "Well, somebody dug it up. Yeah, that's Anasazi. You ever been down to Chaco Canyon, Ross?" "Sure, all them big Indian ruins. Now, that's some bleak country." "Yeah, it is now, but it wasn't back in the 12th century, back when the mesa tops were green with pines and the streams ran clear. The people who made that pot, them and thousands of their kin, built those big pueblos, the great kivas, the ceremonial roads. I've seen that. Quite a complex. Yeah, I think about all those people living the high life. Crops, irrigated fields, comfortable homes. But the climate changed and the drought came on. The forests were gone, used up for all that construction and fuel. And when the rains came, they didn't soak into the mesa top. They flooded down the gullies and washed away the crops. and eroded their irrigation ditches so deep they lowered the water table. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened little by little that the place just couldn't support people anymore. Thanks for the history lesson, Professor, but I suppose you're making a point. Just that they had to adapt in order to survive. They had to learn, they had to change, and they had to stick together. You listen to those old Hopi migration tales about the clans wandering the desert in search of the middle place. Eventually they came back together. Different clans from different places, and they helped each other form a new society. It wasn't the same as before. They learned and they changed. Ross stepped back to the open doorway. What is it you think we need to learn? Better conservation for starters, Jefferson said. More efficient solar and wind technology. Ross sighed. Well, I'd like to get some windmills going up on the mesa. Lord knows we got the wind. My son-in-law, Manny's an engineer, and Greeley here is a first-rate mechanic. Jefferson faced Ross with a hand on Greeley's shoulder. We built our turbine all trial and error, Greeley said, but the next one will go faster. We can teach you all how to build one over yourselves. All well and good, Ross said, but first we got to defend ourselves. We got to face the threat from outside. He tipped his hat in the direction of the river. To a point, Jefferson said, you're right. But I think we can change hostile neighbors into allies to settle things down. And you won't do that by raiding the camps, Greeley muttered. Ross, we could help those refugees and teach them the things they need to know. Ross dismissed that with a wave of his hand. Them wetback squatters and such, they're beyond help. Well, here's the thing, for instance. When your men burned out the camp at Big Bend, you burned up what was left of the tamarisk trees, too. Yeah, Ross held his ground. What of it? Well, that's not a half-bad thing. If they finish clearing out those flats, they could irrigate and plant a couple of good crops. We could help them get started planting this spring. That's taking a lot on. We could do it. Our man Rodriguez, that man forgot more about agriculture than any 10 of us knows together. That's so. And he's willing to go down there to help. Show them how to dig ditches and irrigate. Won't they get flooded out in the spring? Ross, when was the last time the river went over its banks? There's no spring runoff anymore. No snow mass in the mountains. Guess you got a point. He mused on the idea with a twisted smile. And you could do a clinic on butchering beef. Yeah, that's a good one, Ross smirked. It's like Professor Valley Institute or something. Well, Jefferson hesitated. Now that you mention it, Ross raised his eyebrows. We're talking about starting up a school, Jefferson said. That's a hot one. I mean it, Jefferson went on. A regular school, half a day maybe, with regular lessons, reading and writing and arithmetic. And who would teach this school of yours? So happens a couple of ex-teachers just dropped in to stay here for a while. And my daughter taught for a while before she married. Even I could try to remember some of what I once knew. Ross laughed along with him at that. And who's going to go to this school? Besides my grandchildren, you mean? And the other young ones here at the ranch? Why, anybody. We'd get them from the camps, Castleton, even Polar Mesa if they'd like. Ross snorted. Our boys was homeschooled, every one. Billy White just then drew up at the pasture fence, cursing and slashing with his quirt at a balky calf. And what a fine job you done, Greeley said. Fine job. Ross clenched his jaw. At a look from Jefferson, Greeley bobbed his head and slinked away. The two men sat in silence as the cattle surged through the gate and out onto the road, their white faces pointed up toward Polar Mesa, dogs nipping at their heels. A gust of wind huffed the dust cloud out across the valley. You know, Jefferson said, a thing I heard the other day from Cedar Mesa really had a strong effect on me. What was that? About the bristlecone pine? Those old pine trees, they're like hundreds of years old, right? Well over 1,000 years old. Those pine trees were growing up on Cedar Mesa when the ancient ones were building those pueblos in Chaco Canyon. Somehow they survived climate change more than once in their long lives. And I heard the last of those old bristlecone pines was chopped down and burned for firewood. Just made me sick to hear that. Damn, it was. A cowboy whistled. Dogs barked at the stream of cattle flowed up the canyon. Well, thanks for the coffee, Jefferson. I'd best be getting up ahead of them cows. Ross gave an admiring glance back at the eagle kachina and straightened his hat. Out in the yard, Greeley fell in step with them. Why don't I stop by later this week, Ross said, and let me take a look at that wind turbine. That'll be fine, Greeley said. Ross stopped and turned at the Jeep, admiring the sturdy corrals, the neat cabins, the tall cottonwoods of Professor Valley. Can we change, Jefferson? He said. You don't think it's too late? We got to try, Jefferson said. Ross nodded. I'll talk to the families up at the ranch, see what they think about going back to school. All right then, Jefferson said, and watched him bounce out through the gateway. What do you think? Greeley asked. I think we got a lot of work to do, Jefferson said. Let's see if we can get that old school bus running.